Join us as we delve straight into the putrescent juice of Earth's inner horrors. This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. Hi, I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 11th episode in season 3, and we are continuing our discussion of cults. So, Mel, I think that was the grossest intro we've ever done.
Yeah, we've done some disturbing ones, but that's probably the grossest.
I'm going to repeat part of it of the putrescent juice of Earth's inner horrors. Now, if you don't recognize that line, that is from H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Festival, which appeared in Weird Tales in 1925. And one of the reasons that we chose that is because we're going to take a look a little bit at some Lovecraftian cults and some cults in fiction today. Our first episode in this series, we introduced some real life cults, and we did that to try to work towards a definition of what we actually mean when we say cults. Because if we're going to try to understand why horror writers tend to return to that over and over again, and why we still see movies being made about cults, and you know, there seems to be kind of an endless fascination with them in the general public, I'd say. You know, it helps to know why we're scared of it, and what we mean when we say it. And that led into some pretty interesting conversations about, you know, what actually is a cult. And then we kind of continued that discussion in our last mini episode for our Patreon supporters. And we specifically got to talk about Nexium and Teal Swan, which are two movements that are happening today and kind of still ongoing in the news. So it's a pretty timely topic. But in looking at fiction, we found some interesting things. First, we found that there's a lot more written about cults than we realized. Because I think I had mentioned this at the top of the first episode. We struggled really to come up with some names of, you know, okay, what are some cult movies or some cult books that we could talk about, and we came up with a few, but then the more we kept thinking about it, the longer and longer the list got, to the point that I was like, okay, you know, we could do an entire podcast series just on the horror of cults in fiction. And so we decided today to kind of narrow that down a little bit, because there's just too much that we can talk about. And Mel, I know you had found an interesting article that there is actually kind of a spot, and I'm going to use this as a transition from our last episode to what we're talking about today, where there are people who kind of have a cult of Cthulhu or cult of Lovecraft going. So kind of a merging of the two, of reality and fiction.
Yeah. I actually just kind of stumbled upon this in my research for this episode. By research, I mean I was kind of, you know, in a very desultory way, like clicking through stuff about H.P. Lovecraft, and we were trying to decide on what Lovecraft cult story we would talk about for today. And listeners, I'm sure that you guys are familiar with H.P. Lovecraft. Love him or hate him. He was an early kind of figure in, I guess, 20th century horror. He was a pioneering figure in the idea of the weird, which we've talked about on this podcast before. We have also talked on this podcast before about books that rewrite Lovecraftian tales to make them, I guess I would say, friendlier to women and non-white characters. Lovecraft definitely was not charitable to people of color in most of his stories. And the Call of Cthulhu, to a certain extent, is not out of the ordinary in that case. So, just a brief rundown with the Call of Cthulhu. You have a bunch of found documents and journals and historical mentions of this idea of these ancient gods that are somewhere on Earth that are possibly worshipped by people. And then you have these all these people are being like driven mad and creating these artistic visions. And then you have these cults, quote unquote voodoo cults in Louisiana that are worshiping some sort of horrible, destructive god. And it turns out at the end you have that vision of Cthulhu, the tentacle faced monster, coming out of the ocean with his claws, and I believe he even has little wings. And now he's a stuffed animal and a sticker and a lot of memes on the internet. But at the time, there's this idea in fiction that the idea of the weird that several writers are playing with, that there are elder gods or ancient ones that may come back from space and take us out, or are already here in our oceans, and there are groups around the world that worship them in these cults. So when I started looking up information about Call of Cthulhu, I found a couple different articles, one connected to How Stuff Works, which is a great podcast, and then another in The Verge. And basically, the gist is, one, obviously, fans of Lovecraft sometimes have fan groups called the Cult of Cthulhu to kind of be funny because they love Lovecraft's work. Little pun there. But you also have some people who apparently, while they acknowledge the Cthulhu mythos that people have been writing about is fictional, kind of subscribe to the philosophy of it. So they have this idea that there could be extraterrestrial cosmic creatures and that we're tiny in comparison to them. And I guess we may come up against them at some point. Then there are other ones, apparently, other cults that kind of combine the Cthulhu mythos with other beliefs that activate cults. You could plug in almost anything we've been talking about in this series that activates cults and hitch it to Cthulhu mythos, and that would work. But then there's also the Necronomicon hoaxes, which I was like maybe slightly, I mean, I know there's not a Necronomicon, but I had never sat down and read about the fact that there have been multiple hoax editions of the Necronomicon claiming that this book that Lovecraft simply talked about, that would have this like arcane knowledge in it, or people would use it for research. Basically, folks out there, particularly this one guy in the early 70s who called himself Simon, would write Necronomicons. And so I'm pretty sure the Necronomicon that you can buy in bookstores today is the Simon edition, as it's called. And apparently in the 70s, this guy like went into like a magic shop, I think in New York, and showed this antique book and said, "Hey, this has like a Sumerian word, Cthulhu, and I believe it's the Necronomicon." I'm sorry, I guess I shouldn't be laughing, or maybe I should be laughing more. I don't know. But apparently this like took off. And so, you can get it for fun and just to have a little bit of like Lovecraft lore. Or apparently you can chase after what you may believe could be a Necronomicon. That's kind of a rundown of what I found. What was your take, Lisa, when I was sending you these excited text messages about fact and fiction?
Well, I'm really interested in how, I mean, of course, whether or not, however you feel about Lovecraft, and we did have to kind of put that disclaimer, I think, whenever you talk about Lovecraft, but however you feel about him, just the idea even of the Necronomicon has outgrown Lovecraft, and writers have been taking it and making it their own for a long time. So I'm really intrigued by this idea that what is a fictional text has both taken on a life of its own in the literary world, where it's now appearing in different media that really don't have anything to do with Lovecraft, but there's still mention of like a Necronomicon. And I find that fascinating, but also the fact that now it goes from being this fictional object. And just to be clear, like, in what I found really funny in looking at these articles was that people had to like put the statement out there that, hey, there's no mention of a Necronomicon pre Lovecraft. Like there's no, there's no mention of that. Lovecraft, it was a creation of Lovecraft, but that people now have taken it and almost made it into a real life object, or in some cases they did make it into a real life object, and that then that takes on a society of its own. Whether or not you want to actually say, okay, it was a cult, or just a bunch of fans who were excited about this idea, or interested in taking fictional philosophies and combining them with real world philosophies, which that's not something that only happens with Lovecraft. I think there have been other writers who, people have taken their writings and turned into kind of a real world philosophy. But it brings me a lot of joy to imagine that somebody is passing off a book that they've written Secrets of the Dead in and Sumerian words, and and I don't know, but I like these kind of hoaxes. So that's kind of fun. I did want to say before I forget, you were mentioning about how writers today are taking some of these Lovecraftian ideas, and particularly his idea of like cosmic horror, which he really did so well, and fixing the problems that are inherent in some of his works. And one that I do want to mention, and I know we've talked about this before, but is Victor LaValle's The Ballad of Black Tom, because that's definitely a Lovecraftian story, but it does modernize it and kind of fix some of the problems of representation. And in that book, there is a cultish aspect to it, because there's kind of the secret society and worship of something much more ancient. So I want to throw that out there as a recommendation early on in talking about all this.
Oh yeah, and the cult in there is dangerous for the main character, which I think is a fantastic, rewriting of Lovecraft. There's also I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but Kij Johnson's The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, which is a great novella that kind of rewrites or writes back at Lovecraft's The Dream Quest of the Unknown Kadith. I don't know, my Lovecraftian pronunciation is off, so please don't please don't yell at me.
It's difficult when you've only read words and you've never heard anybody speak them to you.
And they're also not real words. They're not real.
Or are they?
They might be. I don't know. I need to find a Necronomicon and look it up. Well, I feel like these cults the cults in quotations, organized around Lovecraft and Cthulhu are like the dark side of the Disney cults.
Friendly mouse.
Squid-faced monster.
Tentacled monster. Yeah, I can totally see that. Although now I kind of want to live in a world where you can not only go and visit Disney World, but you can go see Cthulhu Land.
I'm writing this down on my things to do at my bucket list. Create a Necronomicon Disney World. Get your picture taken with Cthulhu.
That's right. Let's kind of turn this back, because we did mention Lovecraft, because as we're talking about cults and fiction, and I really don't know, because I didn't look into this, but this would seem to be a really early on representation of what we would consider a cult in the modern day use of the word. Is his story The Festival? I mean, I'm sure it's not the first, but it is an early one.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a good, I don't know, we'll have to look into that to be absolutely sure. I would say there were probably cults in 19th century literature, and you could probably interpret some Gothic books as having cults, but I don't know how early it would go back.
Yeah, I mean, there were ones that had like, yeah, I'm thinking about gothic novels right now, but ones that would have like small groups of people who were like Satan worshippers. Uh but it's hard to qualify just like two people, three characters together as a fully fledged, organized cult. So yeah, I'm really interested in looking that up. So I'll have to do a little research on that for us. But for those of us who have not, or I should say for our readers who have not read the festival yet, can you give us the basic uh, premise of the story?
I can try. There's lots of slime and lots of monsters. Basically, it's this guy who was in he was in Arkham Hospital, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And he was told, supposedly, that he was related to these people who were from a town called Kingsport, which I believe is supposed to be in Massachusetts. It's in New England. And just as like a little connection back to our Christmas ghost story episode, this takes place at Christmas. So he talks about like men call this Christmas, but we called it Yuletide in our ancient whatever times that are older than Babylon and Egypt and human beings, as always, because it's a Lovecraft story. And so he goes this old fishing town, and everything is very old and ancient. He talks about how the houses are. I can't remember exactly how he describes it, but the way he describes them is not 19th or early 20th century architecture. He's talking about how it reminds him of a scene from the 1600s. I think he even mentions the Puritans at one point. And so he goes to this house where supposedly his ancestors live, and there's just an old man and an old woman, and they're just kind of chilling in this house. They act like they expect him, but they don't talk to him really. They just write things to him on a tablet. And as in any Lovecraft story, you have to have that really weirdly uncanny in that the man doesn't really look human. Like he looks like he's waxy and has gloves on and maybe not a real face. And so then at a certain time, everybody in this town puts on a cloak and puts a hood over their head and walks to this church where they then go underneath the pulpit into this weird nether world where they chant things and they're like dead people or not dead anymore. And then these weird flying things come down and they jump on them and they fly away. And instead of jumping on the flying thing, he jumps in the putrescent juices of the underground river. So that is kind of that doesn't take you all the way to the end, but that's the basic gist. Dude is told that he's descended from these ancient important people, and he goes and he finds out it's more than he bargained for, I guess. And then ends up escaping by basically falling into like the slime river in Ghostbusters 2 and washes out into the harbor.
Lovely. um, yeah. So, and this is one of those and this is one of the things that I find this story so interesting, because here it was published in the 1920s, and so much of what you described, especially like the main character entering, what seems to be a normal small town, and sees a church, and that you would think is a very picturesque scene, and then suddenly everything starts to go problematic, to say the least. But you see that a lot, where everything seems okay, and then suddenly, wait, this is wrong. And that's why I'm kind of wondering if this is one of the earliest, like we would understand cults, because kind of going back to our initial question of what would be the earliest, before this, it would seem that a lot of them are either writing about one or two characters worshiping like a devil, or communal living, right? Like Nathaniel Hawthorne writing about Brook Farm.
Right.
But that's not at all creepy or horror. I mean, maybe to him it was, because I forget what he complained about when he left. What was it? His hands got too callous to write.
Yeah, it was too much physical work and not enough time to write. It's like
Yeah.
that's the complaint of everybody, right?
They're making me work too hard and I don't have time to write, and so I'm leaving this place behind. But it wasn't like a sinister experience. And here you're seeing something, in fact, reading this, it kind of did remind me a little bit of a Hawthorne story, The Minister's Black Veil, where, for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, it's this Puritan town, I guess, and everything seems good. Everybody's greeting each other and going to church, and it's a happy little town. And the minister suddenly shows up wearing a black veil. Now, there's nothing sinister happening in that story. That was, Hawthorne kind of playing up on people's prejudices and the belief in the supernatural. And it seems to me that Lovecraft was taking that story and rewriting it and was like, oh, yeah, I will actually make the supernatural real. And
It
so,
reminded me. Oh, I was gonna say it reminded me of Young Goodman Brown.
yes, yeah, yeah, I can see that too. I had never made that connection between Lovecraft and Hawthorne, now that we're talking about it. But I really think that around, and I don't think Lovecraft, like I said, was the only one writing this, because I think if we dug around, probably around the 1910s, 1920s, we'd probably see more of this kind of weird fiction showing these societies where supernatural things were happening, whether you want to call them cults or not. But yeah, the festival is a really interesting little story.
Well, it also has a Necronomicon, right? Because
Oh, yes.
that's how he understands what happened to him is he uses interlibrary loan to get the Necronomicon from Miskatonic University, and then he reads what this uh, Arabic scholar like wrote about it.
Well, because apparently everybody was telling him it was his psychosis, right? Um,
Right, yeah, but he had to get the Necronomicon. Also, when he was waiting on the old people to take him to the cult meeting in the little waiting room, the Necronomicon was there. And so he was reading it then as well. It popped up a couple times here.
uh, yeah, but if you look here at this kind of, and this has a lot, let's just say this story has a lot of Lovecraftian touches. There's a lot of putrescence and and that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it purple prose. I'm just looking at this one, line. Then I saw the lurid shimmering of pale light and heard the insidious lapping of sunless waters. He's got, that you can kind of tell that that's Lovecraft, just by the prose there. But there's some really interesting stories going on here. But this idea of that there's something ancient that modern religions don't understand, because I found it really interesting that I knew this was one of Lovecraft's cult stories, or when you mention Lovecraft and writing a cult story, people talk about the festival. I found it really interesting that he set it at Christmas. And I'm not sure if he was drawing upon that idea of, coming out of the kind of Dickensian era of Christmas ghost stories. And he was playing around with that, or if it was just this idea of there is something that's so ancient that it predates anything that we understand. And so these are kind of the people who had found and tapped into that really ancient religion, so it must be the true one, I guess, to these people, because and he makes a point of saying that this goes beyond um, what the modern world understands, because it's something that's so ancient. I don't know. What was your take on that? The fact that he said it at Christmas time.
I thought both of those. I thought it was an interesting play on the Christmas horror story or Christmas ghost story, but also, yeah, he goes on and on about how his people or his ancestors were these dark people who came from other countries, and they were not the same as the blonde-haired, blue-eyed fishermen, and they have this ancient knowledge. And so it seemed to me like it was kind of like he was trying to draw on like a pagan type language, like you were saying. It's before Christmas. It's before Christianity took over that holiday, I guess. The other thing I thought about it too was that it's taking place on Christmas in this Puritan area, and yet this crazy, scary demon type worship stuff is going on in the church. I thought that was interesting. It seemed kind of like a reversal of what you would normally think of with Christmas as well. So yeah, I think he had probably a few reasons for setting it at the Yuletide, as he calls it.
Yeah, he just had to explain, I guess, for us, not so educated readers, what Yuletide was, because he makes a point of explaining that Yuletide is Christmas.
There's an entire paragraph about it.
um, yeah, it's really an interesting, and it, it has this idea, because if you're talking about, going back to our definition of like what makes a cult, and kind of the idea of, and we kind of floated this idea too, like, is a cult just a religion that hasn't taken root in the mainstream yet, so just kind of maybe an unpopular religion, which when you look at this, it kind of does tick that off, because it's not only that their religion is so ancient, but he uses the word ancient to describe this town by the sea. And when I read that phrase, that it was kind of this little ancient sea town, I immediately thought of, even though this story comes later, was Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Just the idea of a town that is so isolated that they've been able to hold on to their traditions, without much interference from the outside world. So I guess it's the idea that, even though the rest of New England would have those Puritan roots that he alludes to, maybe because they are so isolated, they've been able to stave off that influence, which I did find interesting. Of course, it also, because we talked about the problem with cults is that it's not just an unpopular religion, but that it has some sort of sinister aspect to it, and that people could get hurt, and that certainly was the case here, where it seemed like, at least the man was scared enough that he was willing to fling himself into that putrescent juice, to
Hmm.
swim away. So there's the idea of, again, something really sinister going on. Yeah, an interesting story. I mean, I recommend it. I recommend it for people who maybe have read some of Lovecraft, because I don't think the festival is as popular as some of his other things.
No, you don't hear about it as often as some of the other stories. And I mean, he fits so much into such a short space because it's also kind of one of his oh, I don't know what the technical word would be for, but like alternate reality type things too, because you're unclear in the story, like um, what he is seeing and what's real and what's not. And so it could be this kind of Lovecraftian, he slipped across the barrier between our world and another. Could be he's seeing stuff that's there all the time that we don't see. Could be he was in the hospital for a reason. We don't know. And that's one of Lovecraft's strengths, I think.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. He kind of follows in Poe's footsteps with that, of always kind of making us question the main character in the story, and the narrator, um, of whether or not we can trust what's actually being told to us. So I would I would highly recommend it. Um, so when we were looking at how to narrow down talking about the massive problem of cults and fiction, we thought we would kind of stick with this Lovecraftian idea of and see this idea of a cult that is worshiping some sort of ancient being, or dare we say elder gods, to borrow a Lovecraftian term. And Mel, you and I both watched a movie that kind of fits this bill, and we picked this one not necessarily because it's the best, but maybe because it's one of the more recent ones that fits this idea of a Lovecraftian cult / cosmic horror. And that is the movie The Endless, which came out in 2017. And I'm going to go ahead and put a warning right now that if you have any interest in seeing this movie, stop this podcast. Because we are going to spoil some endings. And I will say, if you do want to watch this movie, go ahead and hit pause, because we will be here when you get back to help you dissect. But this is one of those movies, and Mel, you'll probably agree with me on this. I don't think it would be as enjoyable if you knew what was coming.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're just going to throw that out there.
Of course, even if you watch it, you're probably not going to understand what happened.
Yeah, I definitely had to kind of, it was late at night, so I don't know if I was paying as much attention as I normally would have, but yeah, we're gonna go ahead and talk about that. So I'm gonna kind of count down here, just for spoiler warnings. Give everybody a chance to turn it off if they want to. 3, 2, and 1. Okay. We are now in the spoiler zone. So this movie, The Endless, if you guys don't know about it, so it was actually written and directed and stars Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson. So it was kind of one of these things where you had actors who wrote the screenplay and then I guess directed it and took on the leading roles, which I'm always kind of interested. I believe this was an independent film. It's on Netflix now. I'm always interested in people who do that, who kind of set out to tell a story and are involved in so many aspects of it. But the basic gist, at least at the beginning, is you have these two brothers, relatively young. What would you say, like in their 20s?
Yeah, I was, I guess mid to late 20s. When you think, I
Yeah,
guess mid 20s.
mid
It's been
20s.
10 years since they escaped, so
And I'm
probably late
thinking,
20s.
I
Yeah.
would say that the youngest brother maybe like early 20s, no, well, like mid 20s, I'd say. And then the older one is a bit older, so maybe late 20s, entering 30s. It's hard to
Hmm.
it's hard to tell with Hollywood actors. Anyway, they had, the basic premise of it is that they had escaped a cult as children. We say children, but like older children, maybe teenagers. And the idea is that it was one of these UFO death cults. So something similar to like a Heaven's Gate. That's what it really reminded me of was, and I think that's what they were alluding to a lot, because there was mention of, that these people of the cult were waiting for, I guess aliens, and to take them away, and that they were going to commit suicide. There was even mention of castration, that they had all castrated themselves. Although it would seem that the kids escaped before that happened to them. And I know that was something that was talked about with the Heaven's Gate cult. Of course, this is the cult that had the tragic mass suicide what was it, in the late 90s.
I think so.
Anyway, so it seems that they're kind of, it's kind of that sort of thing. And what I found immediately interesting is you see these two brothers trying to reintegrate into society, and they're obviously struggling with it. And Mel, as you had mentioned, it had been about 10 years. And you know, they were having problems talking to people. They're obviously in therapy. It shows them going to therapy, and actually, I think they call it deprogramming. So kind of a cult term there. And there's talk of them struggling to hold down jobs. They're having problems with money. They're having problems dating. They want to date, but they're kind of awkward around girls, and there's some discussion of that. And so I immediately found that dynamic interesting, because I think that's something, normally we get for example, the Lovecraft's The Festival. You get that aspect of it, where you have an outsider who stumbles onto a cult and gets involved in something dangerous. And here you have somebody or two people who were leaving the dangerous situation. So it picks up where most stories end, which is what I found was really interesting. And I honestly, I wish that they had done more with that. But instead, they just kind of use it as a catalyst, because what ends up happening, and I guess it's the inciting incident of the story, is that they get a videotape mailed to them. And the videotape is from the compound, I guess, the commune. They all live out in the woods in this kind of, I don't know, it looked like a summer camp to me. Like, there were cabins and bonfires, and but it showed them there, and so they decide after watching this that they're going to go back. Now, again, this is something that I really wish they had played up a little bit more, because they do it a little bit towards the end, but I wish that they had played up that tension, is that the younger brother really misses the cult. Like, he really misses life on the commune. He misses the people there. And because he left when he was younger, he doesn't have the bad memories that the older brother had. And again, I found that really fascinating, because you don't hear that a lot. A lot of times it's just, oh no, I'm in here with a bunch of crazy people. They're trying to kill me, or they're trying to sacrifice me, and I've got to get out now. You know, that tends to be the storyline. And I thought this was really interesting, was to look at it as somebody who potentially wants to go back in, and it's like, okay, I understand this thing is a cult, and that means it's bad, but that doesn't mean I don't want to be there. And the only comparison I can think of, and I'm gonna have to look up this name, Melanie, because I'm gonna butcher it. Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene. I knew I was going to get that wrong if I didn't look that up. That's a 2011 movie with Elizabeth Olsen, where she played a young girl who had left a cult and was trying to, like, re-assimilate into life after that, and was really struggling doing that. And part of that was because, and the name hints at it, Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, as she didn't know who she was because she'd been renamed. And so her family was calling her one thing, when in the cult they were calling her something different. And it was just this kind of like, what's my identity? Which is something we talked about in the first episode. I wish the Endless had played that up just a little bit more, of this loss of identity once you're out of the place that you call home. Like, once you've left your family behind, how do you and they hinted at that, but I wish they had played it up just a little bit more. I don't know, Mel, what did you think?
I thought the movie was really interesting. I But with the brothers, I liked the kind of conflict between the two of them, though I agree it could have been played up more. But the other kind of nice detail, well, nice is probably the wrong word, but the other detail about this is that they knew no other family than the cult, because supposedly, of course, is coming from the cult leader, but you find out through the course of the movie that the cult really didn't lie so much to them. Like the older brother was so overprotective of his younger brother and wanting to protect him from what he saw as suicide, the ascension, that he basically like came up with some stories that actually weren't true, which hurts him when they have their blow up about it, because then he loses credibility. But you know, and it's unclear. He says he does it to protect his younger brother, but also they like become TV news celebrities when they leave the cult, so it's possible he got hooked up with that. I'm not saying the cult isn't bad. It's just that you find out there's a couple of things that he exaggerated. But yeah, they had no family. Like they were in a car with their mom, if I remember right, and it crashes, and the cult get them out of the car, and the cult raises them. And so for them, there is no like we come out and we find our family. I mean, they're being deprogrammed to just be themselves, but they don't even know who they are because they had no family other than the other cult members. And the thing I found really disturbing, I was thinking of even after the movie ended, was they talk about the weird stack of rock or whatever it was, the staff of rock that's next to where their mom died, which I wondered if that meant that their mom was stuck in one of the loops, living her death over and over again, like we find out other characters are, even though that's not told to us.
Yeah. And
And so they just barely escape that. And so I thought that the idea of family was interesting, that the cult really is their family. So of course they want to go back. Like if you're having a hard time keeping a roof over your head, making enough money to survive, of course you want to go where people give you good food and care about your health and, you know, love you and want to take care of you. Yeah.
yeah, that yeah, a couple of things. The relationship between the brothers was really interesting because you're right in pointing that out. They had no other family, so they had no identity once they left the cult, and I think that was a big part of their problem. Is it was just kind of like, okay, well now we can be anybody, but that was just as terrifying. Um, and I enjoyed. There were a couple of moments that I really, well, again, enjoy is the wrong word. When you saw the overprotectiveness of the older brother, um, there was one point when he had agreed to let his younger brother go back to the commune to see what, because he wanted to go back. He saw it again. He saw it as his family, and he wanted to go back. Um, and there was a scene where they were falling asleep, and the brother was asking him questions and trying to like get more out of his brother, and his brother just kept yelling at him to go to sleep. And that was it was a really kind of violent moment, it felt like, when I was watching it, because you saw how tightly the older brother had held on to his younger brother to, and like you said, to try to keep him safe, and in that may have done some damage. um and he also, as you said, he lied. One of the things he lied about was the castration, which is a
Right.
pretty big thing to lie about. um and it does kind of ruin his credibility. And that was one point in the movie where I thought, is this what the twist is going to be, where you find out that it's really not a cult and that the brother was just lying about it the whole time? But I couldn't figure out what the brother's motivation would be. And of course the brother had been saying, Mel, you mentioned the word ascension, because that's what they all were looking forward to, was the ascension. And he kept telling them that was when they were all going to kill themselves. Well, clearly they didn't, because they were all still alive when they got there. But we find out later, and this is where the movie really takes a twist, and you mentioned it, Mel, with the loops. Apparently, this is on a land that belongs to something strange. We'll just put it there for right now. Belongs to something strange. Something strange is happening. And there are these circles where time is on a loop. And from what I understood, some of the loops are shorter than others, and some of the loops are longer. So one loop, for instance, as they're kind of traveling around this land, you see these two friends who are in a cabin, and apparently they're reliving the same week over and over and over again. But they know they're living it over and over and over again. Another one is just one guy in basically a shack. And he's living time over and over and over again. So kind of time resets for
It's the
him.
same 3 hours.
Yes. Yeah. So it's much shorter. There's one, and this is what was so horrifying. A guy is reliving, 5 seconds
Mm-hmm.
over and over. And he, again, knows what he's doing because he's able to change things at least a little bit because he's able to talk to the characters very quickly. But very horrifying. And the idea is that if you stay there long enough, you get caught in your own loop. And I wondered that too, Mel. There were these kind of, they almost looked like termite mounds. But these tall, like, staffs, I guess, they said they were like volcanic rock or something that they had. There was a reason for them, but that seemed to be what marked the loops, the circles. And one was by the mom's grave, or at least where they wrecked the car. And so I wonder if their mom wasn't in her own loop, but we never met her.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes at that point a race against time. The ticking clock starts at that point, which, it was effectively tense, I'll say, for a thriller at this point, because I was worried. You care about these brothers and you want to see them get out, and they realize at one point what's happening. And it's kind of a race against the clock to get out before they get stuck in a loop. And they realize that's what the ascension is, because the people on the commune can't leave because they're stuck in their own loop.
Yeah, the ascension is that the creature kills them all.
And then they immediately come back.
And then they restart and they have a certain number of years. And that's why they never age, which I couldn't figure out. There were some holes in this because I wasn't 100, I wasn't 100% sure how they were able to like run around all over. Like the creature could have just killed them at any moment. And yet they somehow got, I mean, I love the end, but it also was like, what? But it's a Lovecraftian movie, so they're not going to answer everything.
Yeah. There were some problems. One of the things, predictably, the younger brother wants to stay, and he decides, even though they're on a loop and they
have to die
every few years, like apparently a really violent, bloody death. Even though that has to happen, they and the other characters talk about how horrible it is, by the way, their death, because they several of the other characters kill themselves to avoid the death. So
yeah, they're not a cult, they're hostages, you find out.
Yes, they're basically hostages. But there were a few things I found frustrating. Number one, the younger brother predictably wants to stay. But there's not a whole lot of, to me, it was not believable. He was just like, well, I might stay. And the older brother's like, well, I guess I'm staying too. If you're staying, I'm staying. They kind of do that thing. And then he's like, oh, well, since you believe me, I'll go home with you.
Yeah, that was way too fast.
It happened. Yeah. I'm not even joking, that quickly. And that bothered me. I wish they had like sat on that moment for a little bit.
I mean, the alien was coming to kill him, so they didn't have a lot of time.
But still. The people in the cult who apparently raised them, it bothered me. Okay, so this was never addressed. When they first left, my thought was, did the cult leader push them out to save them, essentially? Was he the one who was kind of the catalyst to push them out? But then at the same time, they were so reluctant because they kept almost like speaking in riddles to them, like, the answers you seek are at the bottom of the lake, or you've got to make a decision before the 3 moons are full or whatever, because the moons, that's how you can tell it's about to change, because first 1 moon and then 2 moons and then 3 moons or whatever. Weird, but it kind of bothered me because I thought, well, the other characters in the other loops could flat out tell them what was happening. we are stuck here. If you stay, you will get stuck here, and it's horrible. We're hostages to this giant monster who wants to eat us, and we don't like it, and we're trying to get out of it. And why did the cult members not just say that? Why didn't they say, dude, we love you. We're glad to see you're healthy. Come back and visit us when it's not monster eating time. But don't stay.
One moon, it's okay.
Yeah. If you see one moon in the sky, you're good to go. Come stay the night with us. Drink beer with us. Have a wonderful time. But we're hostages, and don't stay because you're going to get eaten.
Okay, I think I might have an answer for this. Two things. Bearded Tim, who always wore a little jacket and was like responsible for locking up the whatever it was.
And there was no reason for that room to be locked, by the way.
No, there wasn't. He tells the younger guy when they find out that when they know that they're all about to die again and they're freaking out. Tim tells the younger guy, you don't have to do this. He doesn't explain to him necessarily that he has to leave before the third moon. Aaron, the younger brother, figures that out himself. But I thought that was interesting because he is saying, he's not saying leave, but he is saying leave. And so that got me wondering if maybe the reason the cult says culty things is not because they're necessarily a cult, but because they're being surveilled by this monster. Throughout the movie, the monster is taking pictures of them and videotape of them. The monster sent the video to lure them back. So it's listening to them 24/7 and taking photos of them like all the time and dropping them on their heads, and has been doing this for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So maybe they feel like if they don't talk in riddles, something will happen.
Well, and again, this is where I wish it was explained a little bit, because we do find that they're not a true cult. That's kind of the twist, is that you think you're watching a movie about a UFO death cult, and then it turns into something different. But, there's one of the other characters, the one with the gun.
Oh, the guy with drugs.
Yeah, I can't remember what
his name.
What they call him. They call him something.
Oh, Chris.
Okay. When they go and see him and his friend, they flat out tell him, like, don't worship, whatever you do, don't worship the thing. Like, don't show it fear. I guess, because they're like, then the monster will always be able to control you, and don't, like, just run and don't worship it. And so I wondered if that was kind of what they were doing, like, not really worshiping in the way we would think of as like a full-on religion, but it was like, well, they're allowed to live longer stretches of time because they do play along with the game. And they do, like, they make it almost like a ritual, and that's why they call it the Ascension, because they just go and stand in a circle and let the thing take them. Almost like they're willing participants, even though they're not. So that may explain why they do use those terms of kind of, we don't want to anger this thing any more than we have to, because it could make life really bad for us. Yeah, I don't know. It still doesn't, a lot of it still doesn't sit well with me. Now that I'm thinking, again, it wasn't a bad movie. It was enjoyable to watch. And there were a lot of things that I did like. Mel, I know one of the things that we had talked about too that was really problematic is this is a movie that is full of male characters. And it's hard to find real female characters in this movie.
Yeah, the female characters are just women that they attempt to date, basically. Or a woman. There was one woman who was searching for her husband, but we didn't get her story.
Well, I assumed that she was
looking for Mike.
Yes, the one who was in the cabin with his friend, which was heartbreaking on its own level, because you learned that she has a child, apparently, that she had left behind.
And she's been there like years, maybe. We don't know.
because they're living on different. I mean, he's repeating the same week, but she's. But the thing that again that bothered me is it you made that connection, and so it kind of filled in her backstory. But all you got is she just walked through the background sobbing. That's all you really saw of her.
Now, she was peddling hell for leather to get out of there when the ascension was about to happen. So I'm just hoping that she made it, but she was headed into those time loops. So she was probably just going to get stuck in one.
Yeah, I don't have faith that she. I don't know where she got stuck. I'd kind of like to believe if she did get stuck, she got stuck in the same loop with her husband.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't. Yeah, I think she was heading in the wrong direction. Um,
And just an aside, that loop, I'm pretty sure Chris and Mike are the holdover characters from uh, the Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson's previous movie Resolution that came out in 2012. Apparently, those two characters and the brothers like appear in that movie, and so it's like the same universe, like the same world. Like this is just a different story told, but they're like the brothers were on the side in Resolution, and now they're the main characters. And Chris and Mike had more going on in Resolution. So there's like, so if people are familiar with Moorhead and Benson's work, you might see continuing things. You don't have to have watched the one to get the other, I don't think. But articles I read said that, yeah, it's kind of like this whole, the two movies are kind of like this whole world. It's just different points in the people's lives.
yeah, looking at this, Resolution came out in 2012, and just the like premise of it says that a man imprisons his estranged junkie friend in an isolated cabin in the boonies of San Diego to force him through a week of sobriety. Um, but the events of that week are being mysteriously manipulated.
Yeah, so I
So
think that's like the beginning of their problem. Yeah.
that's really interesting. I haven't seen anything else, and I mean, I would go and watch Resolution. I liked those characters. I thought that was an interesting choice. I also see too. They did one in 2014 called Spring. Now this one does not seem to be connected, but it says the this one says a young man in a personal tailspin flees from U.S. to Italy, where he sparks a romance with a woman harboring a dark primordial secret. And the cover of that looks like it has some tentacle like things coming up.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it now.
So I'm not sure. It's horror sci-fi. The tagline is "Love is a monster." So I'm not saying that that's necessarily connected to all this, but it's interesting nonetheless to think that they've done a whole kind of, um, a whole movie career based around this.
Yeah, with this Lovecraftian weird stuff.
Yeah, I like that. Like I said, I liked the movie. I don't want to come out saying I didn't like the Endless. I thought it was a really interesting premise, and I liked a lot of it. I think there were just some problems, and yeah, I would like to see a few more women characters with more agency.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, the fashion designer type woman who was their friend in the cult, you can tell that she knows what's going on, but she's bought into it because she's like, our death will be quick. And we just, like, we can sit out here and we can do what we want. She talks about how you can follow your passions. And so, I don't know, she's kind of like, trying to seduce Aaron back into it. Seduce is probably way too strong of a word. They seem to have a real relationship, but yeah, again, it was just another tie to pull the brother in. She wasn't really fleshed out anymore. Like we don't quite know why she's there. Um, I don't know. One of the things I thought was interesting about the movie, and it was also devastating to me, and I wish that they had developed it a little bit more. But, Aaron, the younger brother, when he tells the older brother that he wants to stay, and this kind of plays off what was, I think, Anna in the cult says to Shane, the magician guy, at one point. Aaron says he wants to stay even if the monster eats him because his life outside the cult is so lonely and shallow and horrible. And he says at one point, I would rather go through the ascension like every several years and never age and get to have all these wonderful relationships and have a family than to live the rest of my life day after day, like doing what we do. And it was so kind of powerful and disturbing. And then it's just like, we got to run back and see what happens. And then they witness the ascension. And then he's like, I'll stay with you. And then he's like, oh, you finally agreed with me. Let's get out of here. And they go. But that
Yeah.
moment where he's like, our life, like the way you set up my life is sucks so bad. And the fact that we have no family and the fact that this is all we know is so terrible. Like, I would rather just stay here. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, I recoiled from that, and I also could kind of like understand what he was saying to a certain extent. Like, well, I understood why he would think that, I guess. And I thought that was interesting. Is an interesting comment maybe on I don't know, like the isolation of our society, because the cult was very much into having a family, taking care of each other, being able to follow your passions. You know, don't be in a stultifying job that you can barely keep going, and just be surviving. And it's like he would rather be in this cult like thing with this weird monster than to go back to that. And I was like, man, that's kind of an indictment of, I don't know, it was interesting, but it wasn't developed. So it just kind of like fell flat, like
Yeah. Yeah.
amongst all the running, trying to get away from the alien monster thing.
Yeah. And I thought I did think the way that they portrayed the monster was pretty good. When it was actually kind of coming after them, because that could have been really hokey, and I thought that was really well done.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah. I thought that would, yeah, it wasn't, it was believable, you know?
yeah, it was, and there was a moment, and I'm still kind of running over it in my mind, where like, okay, so they escape, and because they drive past the place where their mother had died. And so they're out in like the real world, but then they made the comment, and of course it was a big deal that he had let the younger brother drive out, because he,
Hmm.
it's kind of him relinquishing control. And so you have hope that that lonely life is going to get better, because now he is kind of empowered to make his own choices. And at one point you learn just how kind of bringing, because this was another thing that really stuck out to me, is you realize how sheltered he had kept his younger brother. When, I mean, here you have a man who's like, early to mid 20s, who says like, I slept with a woman last night and it was my first time. And you think they're talking about sex, and then you realize that he literally just slept next to a woman. And the brother is like, you realize that means something else. And he just kind of gives him this look like, what? Like, what do you mean it means something else? And it's like, okay, you got the idea that yes, he knows about sex, but he also really doesn't. Like, he's not just been so lonely, but he's been kept so naive about the outside world, even though he's been in it for 10 years. And so you get a sense that maybe it's going to change for them. But when they're in the car and they're driving away, and there's this kind of sense of relief, he says, oh, the car's on empty. And he says, well, how could we be driving if the car is on empty? That kind of stuck with me, because for just a split second, I wondered if they were in a loop and didn't realize it yet.
I did too. I felt like it was very Inception like,
Yeah,
because they
I was
look at
like,
the
the top is
birds
spinning.
and the birds start acting a little weird, but then it cuts away and the guy's like, "Hey, the car's on empty." And the younger brother says something like, "It's always been on empty."
Right.
And the other guy says, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, how would he still be going if it was on empty, if it wasn't like, broken or no." Well, I'm just like, "Oh crap."
Yeah. Like that kind of, so I don't know if that was, I mean, I'm sure that was intentional to kind of leave it like,
Because the older brother drove all the time. If the car was always on empty because the thing was broken, he would have known,
right. And I mean, there
So,
were
yeah.
issues with the car prior to that. Like, they kept it kept, the battery kept running out. There was
Hmm.
notes like, get a new battery or whatever. But yeah, that kind of, I was just for a moment, and he goes, they kind of laugh about it, but you almost see it in their eyes too, where it's kind of like, which would be
Yeah.
which would be an even more heartbreaking ending, because if they're gonna get stuck in a loop, like, have them stuck in a loop with their family, not just with the two of them, right?
Right. And then it made me wonder if we'd gone full circle because maybe their mom had put them in the car and was trying to escape the place
Yeah,
and was in a loop of constantly trying to escape the place.
yeah.
And then probably thought crashing the car would end the loop like everybody else saw it, and it didn't. And the cult people get them. So I'm like, yeah, I wondered if they were just redoing what their mom had done.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a weird kind of trippy movie, but it's fun.
I love that moment where you see the shadow of the thing possibly under the lake, but you're not sure, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, that was
That was an
fun.
awesome
I
shot.
will say this is a really visually good movie to watch. Like, it's just it's interesting. You can tell this was made by somebody who loves films and who loves to make films. Um, and so yeah, there were a lot of really good shots that I was like, oh, that was really well done, that I enjoyed. And a lot of motifs kind of carried through in a nice way. So yeah, I like it. Well, I thought, now that we've ruined the movie for everybody, we would recommend a few other cult movies and books that we've enjoyed. Because, like we said, there's just so many that we haven't been able to talk about all of them. So, Mel, do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Do we want to go back and forth, or do we just want to give all our recs at
No, I
once?
think just go ahead and lay them on me.
Okay, here you go. Well, even though it's not in our notes, I had thought about the Ballad of Black Tom, but we already talked about that, so that definitely has a cult in it. Also, I think I might have mentioned this book before when we talked about haunted houses, but Chris Bajalian's The Night Strangers, which suffers a little bit from trying to take on like all sorts of different aspects in its plot, from like twins to haunted houses to trauma to a Rosemary's Baby type witchy cult that loves to give people herbs and different things and tonics and smoothies and whatnot. Basically because they have nefarious ideas about people's children. So if people are interested in kind of Rosemary's Baby type witch cult people next door, that might be an interesting book to check out. And then while I was thinking about this today, I thought of, because I've been watching the latest season of Doctor Who, I thought of the classic Doctor Who episode, The Demons or Daemons, which I want to say people complained about the fact that it had like satanic things in it, where the evil master, the nemesis of the Doctor, summons a bunch of demons and creates a cult. So he basically turns this small New England town that seems so pleasant and wonderful into this cult that's very Shirley Jackson-esque, where everything seems perfect, but you gradually realize everything's really screwed up. So, yeah, it's classic Doctor Who, so it's a little hokey, but I thought that was kind of an interesting science fiction meets the supernatural. And then it has, people in robes and hoods and all that kind of stuff that we were talking about with Cthulhu and the festival.
Yeah, I actually I'm not familiar with either of those, so I'm gonna have to add those to my list. Well, I have a few. So my first I'm gonna recommend, and I'll just go ahead and say I liked it. Kind of like The Endless, I didn't love it. There are things that I would change, but I did enjoy this. So if you just want a straight up cult movie, I recommend The Sacrament, the 2013 Ty West film. So if you're familiar with Ty West, he did The House of the Devil, which is one of my favorite movies, which is also kind of cultish. That's more of a satanic cult. The Sacrament is pretty much a fictionalized Jonestown. Like, if you're familiar with the Jonestown story, you will see a lot of familiar elements here. I think he heavily researched that when he did The Sacrament. This is a movie. It stars Joe Swanberg and AJ Bowen, and it is one of these films that I had to like stop and compose myself. It is so tense. It is so tense. So if you're looking for just a really kind of tense thriller, this is really good. And like I said, it's pretty much straight up what we think of when we think of a cult movie. The other one that I love, and I think I have mentioned this a few times, but is The Invitation, which is a film that it's directed by Karin Kusama, and it's actually written by her husband and his writing partner. So it's one of these that was kind of like a family affair, I guess, in making it. But oh my gosh, this movie, I don't even want to say anything else about it except that, as the title suggests, it's about this man who accepts a dinner party invitation at his ex-wife's house. So right there, that just starts the tension. But that movie is so good. Oh, y'all, it's so good. And it stars Logan Marshall Green. And part of the reason I did not want to talk about this movie on the podcast is because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. I just want everybody to go out and watch it and then find me later and thank me. Because it's one of my favorite movies. So The
I
Invitation.
remember when you watched it.
I get kind of annoying with stuff like that when I love it. I'm like, everybody must love the same thing I love. But I love The Invitation. Okay, and so the other, now as far as films, I want to recommend Mandy. I have not seen it yet. It's on Shudder currently, which I love Shudder. If y'all don't have that streaming service, I love it. It's on my to watch list. I just have not watched it yet, and I've heard great things, so I'm excited about it. In the book realm, I recommend Emma Cline's The Girls, which is, again, kind of like The Sacrament is inspired by Jonestown. This is kind of inspired by the Manson family. But the reason why I wanted to recommend this novel is because it's solely focused on kind of the girls who follow a cult leader. So the cult leader is in the background, but he's not the focus of the story. It's the women who choose that lifestyle, which I wanted to point that out because, as we talked about in The Endless, that's kind of a problem in some of these cult movies and stories, is that it tends to be focused on a leader, which is usually a male leader. And you don't get a lot of the women's point of view. And so The Girls is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. I want to read Adam Neville's Last Days. I've been hearing really great things about it, and I still haven't read it yet. And I understand it involves a cult. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that out there as with an asterisk of I haven't read it yet, but I really want to. It's at the top of my list. So
I've heard great things about The Girls. I need to put that on my TBR.
it was good. It was one of those that I had heard so much hype. I was almost prepared not to like it,
Hmm.
because just so many people were buzzing about it, and sometimes those are hit or miss when people, when that kind of buzz generates about a book. Sometimes it fails to live up to its reputation, but I liked this one a lot. And I liked the angle that it took of, yes, there's a cult, and yes, there's a cult leader, but that's such a small, like I said, kind of background part to it. So, and despite its size, it was a really fast read. So yeah, I recommend that. Speaking of women in cults, and in our last Patreon, I think we brought up the question of, are there female cult leaders? Because, it's easy to think of a lot of male cult leaders. And in my mind, they tend to be male when I think of a cult. So I'm just going to kind of dangle that out there as a little teaser, because I think in our next mini for our Patreon supporters, we might tackle that topic of who are the female cult leaders, and have there been many out there, and what are the differences between a female-led cult and a male-led cult, because I find that really fascinating. So that will be coming soon for our Patreon supporters. Yeah, any final words, Mel?
No, I don't think so. I'm going to be thinking about the end list for a long time, I think. And I'm looking forward to talking about these women cult leaders.
Yeah, you'll be thinking about it endlessly.
Oh,
Ah,
nice.
boo. I know, I had to. I'm sorry. That was
No,
bad.
no, I liked it. I'm a fan of puns.
Okay, well, before I get any punnier, I think we need to say goodbye. Thank you for listening. We ran a little long on this, but thank you so much for listening. Thank you guys for supporting us, whether it's on Patreon or whether you're just telling your friends or leaving us a review. It all helps. And we will join you next time with the end of our cult series. So, talk to you soon.